Anyway, Colonel Halvorsen is going to talk about his experience with the C-54 during the Berlin airlift and the experiences he had with the candy bombing and some other things that he's been very actively involved in and still very much involved with the project. And so we'll turn the time over to him. I'm sure he'll answer any questions that you have. And we'll just let you run it to any way you want to. If you use the mic, I'll let it up and turn it up. No.
Well, anyway, he's got a stronger voice than I have, but he'll get the volume up here in a minute. It's really great to be here at Hill Field, Hill Air Force Base. Been in and out here a few times. But the best part of it is to see some old friends. Colonel Butler here, he and I beat a lot of sugar beets to death. Did with Gus Dean Korth from Garland. And all of us out in the field with Harold Strand and Bert Strand were here. And in the sugar beet field, we were out in the fishing streams together when we were young guys growing up in school. And the sugar beets, the reason I stayed in the Air Force. That's enough to cure me a farmer right away. Now I'm back farming down Spanish Fork. I give this man a count. I don't hear anything different. Is it coming back? Okay. Yeah. All right, that's better. I've got a cold, so I'll need the mic to keep from losing the voice. But it's great to see old friends again. To be back in the same room with people that mean an awful lot to you. And the others here that I'm sure we crossed paths at one time or another together. A week ago today, I was in Omaha, Nebraska at SAC headquarters, and the British Broadcasting Company had a team out there doing their news and asked to come back there and record some material for a 1995 series on people and events of the century they're putting together to come out in 1995. And it just one thing after another was going on. In January, I was back in Berlin, participating in the ceremony of turning Temple off, the base inside of Berlin, back to German control. The American Air Force has controlled Temple off in the city of Berlin since 1945. And now in January, we turned the control of that air base back to the Germans. Paul Greer family. Paul, are you here yet? There he is, right here. He and his family, or not his family, but at least Paul was serving in Berlin when he went back in the 70s to 74. So got known his wife and kids for a long time, and it's just great to be here with you again today. But things are still going on back there. They'll have a big exhibit on this project at the civilian airport in Frankfurt. Any of you over that way in May, well, probably starting in March until June next year. We'll have a big exhibit on the operation I'm going to tell you about. The C-54, what they're doing here at the museum is bringing in people to talk a little bit about the airplanes that you see out here that people have been associated with. When I got through flying school, I went through flying school with the Royal Air Force. I trained in the Royal Air Force. When I finished, the Air Force, American Air Force took me back, and what they needed at that time was transport pilots. So I went into transport operations after training to be a fighter pilot. But started out with C-47s and DC-3s, Dakotas, different names they've got out here in South America and Africa, and flew to England a good bit during that time, and taking over B-26 and other airplanes to break down in South America. We ferried them over there. And they brought 54s into the South Atlantic Theater, and I checked out 54 and started flying those in about 1945, and stayed with that airplane for a long time. So it's a great airplane. It's not pressurized, so it's not a high altitude airplane, but it's a really good flying platform. It's an exceptionally good instrument airplane. You just about fly it almost hands off. The thing is just a beautiful instrument airplane. So we like to fly it. So at the end of the war, we started to realize something about what the Russians were really like. The airlift came along, and I won't take a lot of time on that background to talk about the factors that led up to the blockade of Berlin, but it was located, the city was located 110 miles inside what was East German, West German border into East Germany. And at the end of the war, of course, they cut up Germany in two pieces, and the Berlin being the capital and the focal point for German nationalism, located within the Soviet-controlled East Germany. They said, hey, we're going to cut it up too. We're going to slice it up in pieces so no single country controls Berlin. And so, of course, they had Free Berlin under the British, French, and the American control, and then the communist side of Berlin under the Russian control, which is the largest piece of the pie of West Berlin. So at that time, the Russians, of course, had never seen capitalism behind Iron Curtain. Never been an island where the people could walk up and see exactly what it was under a capitalist form of government, free agency, where people directed their own destiny. And of course, the Russian soldiers, 300,000 of them, stationed in the area around the city. And they can swarm across the border. No wall until 1961 to separate it. And they come across the border to see what's happening. Well, the rubble was getting picked up. People had their own investment in an apartment, and they cleaned it up. Window boxes and bottom out apartments with flowers in it. The rubble was getting cleaned out of the streets. The shops had different kinds of consumer goods in it. More food, more finished goods. And the Russian soldiers would come back across the border to the barracks that night, and they said, hey, these capitalists aren't that bad. What's wrong with it? Everybody's going around with a purpose. Things are improving. Look how good they are over there. Look at the difference. The system must not be that bad. And so the Russians said, we can't compete. We can't compete with words and what it's like to have a person decide what they're going to do for themselves. That's the greatest power, in my view, there is in the world. The power of desire in everybody to direct their own destiny, to have an effect on what's going to happen, an input. That's the greatest thing, the power there is, and it's inside everybody. It's differentiated. No matter where you are politically, that desire is still there and is very strong. And so this is the important power that brought down the countries in the East. It wasn't the atomic bomb, it wasn't the aircraft or tanks or anything else. So what happened is finally that people pulled that power until it was just too much to handle. And so East Germany fell, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, the rest of them came down for that. Well, this is the spark that they can see then. And it's not been too far below the surface since the blockade of 48-49 of Berlin. In 1953, these Germans said, hey, they had that spark thing. They got together and didn't have an uprising. And they put it down brutally. Tanks and killed, we still don't know how many people they killed. But that never has disappeared. So that's what they saw. And the Russians said, we can't compete. We got to do something make a very long story short. They said, this city is in our territory. A mistake was made in letting the Allies in here. We're going to cut off all food supplies. There's no reserve. We're going to cut it off, and then we'll take control of the city. It should be ours anyway. So they did. They simply put guards on the Autobahn. They said the bridge over the River Elbe has been damaged so much in bombing. It's unsafe. You can't travel across the Autobahn to the city. They pulled up the rails in the railroad track, so the rail's not safe. You can't go to Berlin on the rail anymore, taking supplies. The locks in the canal that connected the Elbe, deep sea port of Hamburg, the Elbe River, and then taking canals off the Elbe into Berlin to bring in the heavy bunker fuel, coal, and everything else. They blocked the locks, so sorry about that, technical difficulties, and they waited. They said, they're going to revolt, they're going to have riots. If they don't start riots in Berlin, we'll start them ourselves. We'll send in our own people, and we'll start the riots, and then we'll move in with our tanks and put it down, and we'll take over West Berlin. Well, make a very long story short, we said, well, we're going to force our way in the ground. We're going to put armed convoys on the train system, take them in, fight our way into the city. Do the same on the Autobahn. And everybody said, hey, we just finished the war. We cut all the military support, which we often do. Things are over, and so everything's cut. We relax back. We have the atomic bomb, the way to deliver it. That was about all. And they said, well, we better not try that. And then the treaty said, the air treaty between the Soviets And the Allies said that 24 hours a day you can access the city of West Berlin from West Germany through the air, through 3 air corridors overflying East Germany into Berlin. 24 hours a day you can have that access. So a decision was made to fly supplies, to supply over 2 million people by air. And the C-54 was the principal aircraft for the Americans to do that job. When the airlift started, when they cut off the supplies, there were about 100 C-47s in the European theater. Started to fly supplies in. The first day we flew in 80 tons of supplies to Berlin. The requirement's 4,500 tons a day to provide over 2 million people a starvation diet. And so it was obvious that we had to bring a lot of aircraft. So they brought them in. At that time, I was riding my girlfriend out of Jolly. She was out west, and I was back in Mobile, Alabama. We weren't getting along too well. My handwriting wasn't too good. She couldn't read it. I really liked her. So it was a pretty cool relationship. When this thing came up, I volunteered to go with the airlift and fly with 4 aircraft that was leaving Mobile immediately for Frankfurt. So I went over and started flying early, some of the earliest 54s that were assigned on the airlift. And then by the end of September, this was early July 1948, by the end of September, all of the C-47s were taken off the airlift. And all of the American effort was through C-54s flying out of Frankfurt, Rhine-Main, and Wiesbaden, just 30 miles down the road. And from the British zone in the north, Sully and Fosberg, half of our C-54s ended up being up there. Altogether, we had about 260 C-54s in the system, flyable at any given time, a lot more in the pipeline, but to supply that city. The aircraft would carry 10 tons of flour, dried food, medicine, coal. We flew more coal than anything. Energy is one of the most crucial things we have, and we don't realize that when people love food. But for Berlin, we flew more coal than anything in the city to provide the wherewithal energy to make the city work on a minimum basis. No lights in the city except 2 o'clock in the morning for the civilian population. Turn them on at 2 o'clock in the morning for about 2 hours, and people get up and do their ironing, whatever they have to do, but no lights for the civilian population except that time. So it was a critical delivery problem, and the C-54 would make it easier for us than the British. The British had Dakotas, C-47s, and these kind of and Lancasters and Sunderland flying boats. They flew salt to the city. The British supplied the city of Berlin with salt. They did it with the Sunderland flying boats because they were treated, their hulls were treated for corrosion, ocean operation. And so they take the salt, huge, those of you who've been to Berlin, there's Wannsee and Havel, a lot of water there. The approach was more difficult because they didn't have some sophisticated landing systems we had in Tempelhof and Katyn. But that was the situation. Started flying stuff into the city. The Russians, Stalin says, hey, you can't do it. They're not going to be able to do this thing by air. And he just was laughing at us. And it was summertime, so the weather was good, and we kept bringing in more aircraft. And by the end of September, we were up to the minimum 4,500 tons a day. But then they saw and said, well, the weather's going to go sour, and we have some really bad weather in Berlin, and we won't be able to fly into the city and maintain that during the year. So we had radar came in, got radar, and we made an approach at the airfield. There was an airplane every 3 minutes coming into any one airfield. 3 airfields in the city, so it was an airplane touching down almost every 60 seconds, somewhere in the city. And sometimes the weather was so bad we couldn't maintain quite that intensive level. But our instructions were you come into the airfield, make an approach, and if you didn't break out to see the land, you'd have to take the load back to West Germany, because there was an airplane right on your tail. You couldn't possibly make one circuit and get in. If we were in Frankfurt and the weather was closed, if the airport was closed in Berlin, we still would take off from Frankfurt to Berlin, because it's about an hour and 40-minute flight. And if you waited until the weather cleared in Berlin to land, you'd have an hour and 45 minutes wait with no aircraft coming in, bringing supplies to the city. So the second it was possible to land in the city, you had 100 feet ceiling, there'd be an airplane on the approach, and you'd be landing. A lot of times we'd come in and we didn't want to take the load back, so many times we made landings below minimums. But with the radar guys we had there, the G's ground control approach guys, the long-range radar to keep us in a line, one right up there, but a proper distance apart. It was a fantastic operation. Well, very quickly, I wanted the operation that's kept me going. Today and next week I've got another appointment, and the week after that another place to be. But it's been crazy the way it's been going. It just keeps going. The thing about the kids in Berlin and what happened to them. But I thought being a kid on the farm in Garland, Utah, the furthest I got away from home, well, I got out of high school gloves and I got on my brother's horse and pretty wild and ran away with me. I got almost in the next county before I got to stop. But I always wanted to see more of the world. Interested in geography, and I enjoyed that a lot. And wanted to see what it was like. And I always read about the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate and Hitler's bunker. And boy, I wanted to see these things. And coming into the city, flying over the city, it just looked like it had been completely wiped out. There was only one building in 5 that was partly usable in Berlin. The British and American bombers did such a complete job on that city that there was only one building in 5 that's partly usable. I flew in the first time and I could see the city. It was just unbelievable. Then with a map I'd already studied, I'd pick out the Brandenburg Gate, the Reichstag, and where Hitler's bunker would be. But we landed in Tempelhof, and we'd have to leave the second it was unloaded. We couldn't spend any time in Berlin. The General Turner said, look, you can't even go into base operations. We'll have a snack bar come by your airplane. And you stay right there, and the weatherman will come by your airplane. And the second that last cycle flies off your airplane, get those engines going, get out of here. Because when we first got there, we had to make 3 round trips a day. And that took about 17 hours. And we just sleep enough to get some sleep and go do it again. So we got on our airplane so we could get back to 2 round trips a day. And so we might get through in the middle of the day. And you go to bed and then start flying at midnight or whatever, 6 or 7 hours later. And so we couldn't go in. And we'd leave again immediately. I thought the airlift would be over right away. And I wanted to see what the rest, wanted to walk around with it, get a Jeep and take a look at it. Because I knew when the airlift was open, they wouldn't let everybody come to Berlin and sightsee. They'd send us back to the States as fast as we were over there. So one day I finished my flights about noon. It was a beautiful day. Instead of going to bed, a friend of mine in the squadron right next door was at C-54 loaded and was just coming out to take off to Berlin. And I had my movie camera with me, and I said, hey, I'll go back to Berlin with you. And I got a Jeep, I got a buddy that's got a Jeep there, and he'll take me all around Berlin, and I'll get some pictures. If I ever any kids, I'll show them the approach, because Hitler made the runway too short for us. The bombed out buildings on the end of the runway, right next to the end of the runway. We'd have to pop over the buildings to get down right quick, to get on the runway very fast. Or if we had a little water on the runway, we'd go off the end. And so the approach was bad. So we got a runway built between the buildings. And then we come down between the buildings over the graveyard. And that was an easier approach. But I wanted to get a picture of the approach over the buildings. And so, and before I got on the Jeep, I ran around the other side of the field, approach the end of the field, about 2 miles from where the terminal was over here when I unloaded. And the approach end of the runway was over here. The regular winds would come in here, land, taxi, down the runway, and unload over here. So I ran around inside the barbed wire, 2.5 miles. I started taking movies of the airplanes parking over the buildings. And a bunch of kids all of a sudden were about 30 of them, standing on the other side of the barbed wire, right up against me, having a uniform on. And they came right up, about 30 of them, 8 years to 14 years old. And they started asking me questions in English. They teach English in the schools, and they understand it very well, and they did very well in talking to me. And they asked for first, how many sacks of flour you got in this airplane? How many airplanes? And I tell them, well, we got more airplanes coming every day, we're building it up, we're going to take care of it. But they got off that subject, the flour, right quick. And they started to talk to me about freedom. These kids, I couldn't believe it. Here I was American, I knew all about freedom, I thought, but I didn't realize the depth of their understanding. They've been under Hitler, and they didn't want to do this system. They knew what the communist system was like, because their aunts and uncles across the border, in East Berlin, East Germany, they'd come across the border into West Berlin, and go to the library and find out what's going on in the world. And they'd tell their families, boy, it's terrible over there. They tell us what they want to about the truth that's going on in the world, what things are like. We can't vote for anybody. We can't express our opinions. We can't travel. If we go to the next town, we have to register with the police. We can't leave the country. We can't say what we think about religion or anything. And so, wow, the kid says, we don't want anything to do with that. Most kids gave me a lesson in freedom I've never forgotten. They said, look, we don't need much to eat. Just give us a little. Don't give up on us. Someday we're going to get enough to eat. But if we lose our freedom, we'll never get it back. And I was amazed. I spent too much time with the kids. I thought the Jeep would be gone, so I started to run. A little voice said, hey, these kids are different, how come? And I thought, well, they got a postgraduate degree in international relations. Boy, they experienced it firsthand. Most of them were orphans. And then I said, well, that's not the answer. And it bothered me so much, I stopped. I was thinking so hard about that Jeep, and it amazed me that this thought just kept coming to me. A little prompting. And then I realized what it was. I'd flown in South America and Africa and Great Britain during the war. You walk down the street, and the kids in those places would chase you in bunches and grab your arm and shake you down. You've had that experience, Hubert. And they'd shake you down, obnoxious. And demand gum and candy. You're a rich American, you got a pipeline to a drugstore, you want some of that stuff. And they'd hold you hostage, so they'd fork it over and escape. So I'd always go around with gum and candy in my pocket. They'd give me, I'd hand out to them and take off. And these kids hadn't had any gum and candy for months. They were 10 times as bad off as the kids in West Germany. And out of 30 kids, not one of them would lower themselves to become a bear or to show ingratitude for what we were doing to bring them enough to eat, to stay free. And it blew my mind. Kids that young would be that mature. They knew they had me captive. I was right there across the barbed wire fence. But crumb, they could ask me. They must know I had something in my pocket, but not one of them asked. And the contrast was so marked that I just reached my pocket while I was 2 sticks of gum. Now, 2 sticks of gum and 30 kids, you're going to have a fight on your hands if you try and give them 2 sticks of gum. And so I started out again, and that little voice came back, even Scrooge you give them 2 sticks of gum. And so I thought, boy, they're going to fight, it's up to them. So I reached my pocket, pulled out 2 sticks of gum, turned around, headed back, and the kids were still waving at me. It's still European custom. You visit somebody, they're out in the street waving as far as they can see it. And the kids were still waving. But when they saw my hand come out, they quit. And boy, they really got a look on their face because they knew something come out of my pocket. I went back to the fence and they really crowded out. I took the 2 sticks, broke it in half, and had 4 pieces and passed it through the barbed wire to the kids that were doing most of the translating. And boy, they went bananas. They just went crazy. And the other kids started pressing, oh, here comes the fight. But they didn't. The other kids started to talk. And then I knew what they wanted. And they just wanted a piece of the wrapper. And so they asked for the wrapper, and the kids that got the half a stick started to roughly tear off the outer wrapper with a tin foil and hand it to them. And the kids would smell it. Their eyes would get big. They'd remember what it was like to have gum. And I just stood there dumbfounded. Thought for 30 cents I'd give them a whole stick of gum and let them keep the wrapper and everything. Had one for everybody. Put them on easy street, one fell swoop. But I was going to lose all my sleep. I wouldn't be able to sleep at all for another whole 3 periods. And I knew I couldn't get back to them again. I didn't know when. About that time, an airplane flew right over our head because the runway was right on my back. I was right into the approach to get the movie. And the airplane went over my head. So I said, wow. So if I airmail it, I can deliver it tomorrow and not lose any sleep. And then I was horrified to hear what I was saying to the kids. I said, look, if you promise to share it and equally between everybody, when I come into land tomorrow, one of my 3 trips, when the weather's good or I can see you, I'm going to drop some gum out of my airplane to you, so you all have some. And I'll even drop some chocolate. And boy, the time we got to that translate, they went crazy. And they said, oh yeah. So I said, I gotta go, I'll see you sometime tomorrow. And I started to run, they started screaming again. You know, wait a minute, what's the matter now? And so I went back to the fence and I said, look, if you don't come late in the afternoon, we'll be so tired staring at every airplane so we don't miss that little tiny package. We might lose them. And we've got to know what airplane you're in so we can all watch that airplane. And I said, well, I don't know. They've got different tail markings. Alaska's got red tails, red wings. Hawaii's got green, fly whatever airplane's ready. I don't know what airplane's going to be. It's got 4 engines for sure. That's not good enough. I said, we've got to know. That little package is everything. And then I remembered when I learned to fly in 1941, I got a flight scholarship out of Brigham City. They had a high school, a ground school at Bear River High School and a Box Elder High School in Auckland. And then at the end of teaching the ground schools, they gave 10 flight scholarships out of these 3 schools, about 150 students. After you took the private pilot license, and they give you a flight scholarship to get a private pilot license. Boy, frankly, I didn't have anything but plenty to eat and a lot of love and holes in my shoes, and I could never afford to fly. But boy, when I heard that, I decided, man, I'm going to memorize that stuff. So I did, I was motivated, I got on the flight scholarships, and Johnny Ware, a friend of mine just told me he died just a week ago of a heart attack. But old Johnny was up there at Brigham City, and many of you know him, flying 76, 80, 78 years old, instructing him. And what a great guy. And I learned to fly. Now, my first solo cross country on my own, I was going from Brigham City up northern Utah, from there over to Logan and back. And so I took off out of Brigham City and headed up northern Utah over Garland, Tremont, and I looked down there in the field, there's Dad and sugar beet cultivator. And all I had was 2 horsepower. Before here I had 85 horsepower in front of me. With all these shiny instruments, no dust or nothing, up there above the stuff. Boy, that was pretty neat. And so I saw him, and then Mom was out in the garden. I said, boy, I better show them how I can fly this thing. So I did a couple of circles, got a little more altitude. But at that time, for private pilot lesson, you had to demonstrate the ability to do spins. And in order to, so that you got out of control, you could get out of spin. That's a pretty spectacular looking thing. It takes not much skill just to remember which way to shut a stick. And so I pulled up the nose, kept the power, and did a 2-turn spin right over the farm. Well, I thought that was pretty good. I had a big black dog that chased airplanes. Some chased cars, but that old chef chased airplanes. He chased me across the sugar beet field. I went to Logan, came back that night. Dad was met me at the door, real stern. He said, you're through, you're done. I said, how come? He says, Mom thought you were going to crash. You fainted, and I thought you were going to die. You're through flying. And I said, well, no, don't do that anymore. Don't do that anymore. So next time I fly over the farm, I just wiggle the wings of the airplane. So I told the kids, I said, look, kids, I have to come right straight over Temple off over the radio beacon before I make a right-hand turn during VFR approach, otherwise the GC approach, you wouldn't see me. I'd be coming around the other way, the weather would be bad anyway. So the only time I'm going to drop is when the weather good, you can see me over the top of the airfield on the VFR approach. So I'm coming across the beacon, watch the field above, and I'll wiggle the wings of that big 4-engine airplane. When you see those wings wiggle, that's it. So they said, no more, get out of here, let's get started with this thing. Well, I got the Jeep, went around town, and I still got those movies. BBC just Saturday, they got those movies back to Washington, D.C., making copies. They've already been on television 4 or 5 times all over the place. Those original movies in the fence. So I went back, and we couldn't buy very much gum candy. It was a crisis then, and we had a ration card. The military would only buy a limited amount each week. And I didn't have enough. I wanted to give them a lot of chocolate, too. So I went to my co-pilot engineer and said, hey, guys, I got to have your candy ration. What are you going to do? He said, going to buy a camera on the black market? And I could have. For 3 weeks candy ration in West Germany, I could buy a German camera on the black market. Crumb